Hello, and welcome to Insight Future's podcast, Time for Action. This is week 4 of our 12-week countdown to COP26, the 26th annual UN Climate Change Conference of Parties, which will be hosted in Glasgow from the 31st of October to the 12th of November. The focus for this week's episode is levers. Our CEO, Doug Morwood, speaks with Duncan, the COP26 Stakeholder Manager at Glasgow City Council, where they discuss levers for change within a system and what levers are needed in order to move forward towards a sustainable economy. So, without further ado, let's dive straight in. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy this week's episode of Time for Action.
Hi, I'm here with Duncan Booker, COP26 Stakeholder Manager for Glasgow City Council. Hi, Duncan. Welcome to our Time for Action podcast.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me, and hello to all your listeners. It's great to talk to you again.
Yeah, it's good to see you again, Duncan. So we're going to talk about levers for change in any system change in order to move forward towards a more sustainable economy, whether that might be a circular economy, a low-carbon economy, a well-being economy, or a combination. So first of all, tell me a bit about your background and your current role, Duncan.
Thanks very much, Doug. Yeah, I'm fortunate enough to be working with the Council's COP26 team for this extraordinary event. And I always say to people, it's a very big event. And like any very big event needs managing, but it's also a very big event with content, meaning and intention. And part of my job is to link that to our existing ambitions here in Glasgow to become more sustainable, more just and more climate resilient, and to ensure we get that elusive L word, legacy, from COP, so that when it leaves town on the 12th of November, we hope with a planetary saving agreement in the nation's pockets, we also in Glasgow have that legacy of enhanced conversations with our people in their communities, with our institutions, and with a vision for a much better, more sustainable city going forward. So no small aims there, Doug.
Some big ambitions. It's great to hear. From one L word, legacy, to another, levers. Glasgow City Council has made a binding commitment, as you mentioned, to net zero carbon, a just transition and legacy, and also published a circular route map, which I found really interesting. How important are they, first of all, in setting a vision and intention and objectives for a more sustainable city, but also the identification of relevant levers that can trigger more enabling conditions for even exponential system change?
Absolutely, Doug. And I think what we found in the last maybe 18 months or so, in part, I have to say, helped by the momentum given to us by the imminent arrival of COP26, is I think a much broader perspective from the city and particularly from the council and its leadership role with partners across Glasgow around the kinds of things we need to be doing. So there's that overall commitment, as you said, Doug, to achieving net zero carbon emissions by the year 2030, which came out of our all-party climate emergency working group. But alongside that, we've also published a strategy for climate change adaptation, recognizing that no matter what we do with emissions, the weather is changing and we need to adapt and we need to protect our most vulnerable communities and also our businesses from that. And a whole range of other ones, like a city food plan, as you've already mentioned, the circular economy route map. So looking across those systems as a whole, Doug, and I think that is where much of the kind of real work's going to have to find itself, not just in the development of strategies, some of which in truth over the years find themselves gathering dust on shelves or e-dust and unlooked for websites, but much more around how we mobilize that collective will and how, if necessary, we transform our institutions as much as the city upon which those institutions rely and to which they serve. So that's going to be really interesting, Doug. That brings up questions about our governance and the ways we do things, which are as challenging as the technical aspects of reducing carbon emissions and all the kind of innovation around technology you need. So I'll maybe come on a bit more to that in a minute.
No, it's very interesting. I think that there's another L word around leadership. So, and the idea that, there are significant levers and some of them can seem fairly obvious in terms of cause and effect, and others can have unintended negative consequences or externalities. We've had a big lever just been passed yesterday, I suppose, in Westminster in terms of adding a percentage to national insurance as a way to try and generate income, I suppose, for the Exchequer to then to apply to the health and social care. There are many levers: political, economic, social, business, funding, investment. How important is it to understand that some of these can have big impacts, but also to understand potentially the negative externalities as well.
Absolutely, Doug. I mean, I hate to riff with you on the L word a bit more, but I'm going to introduce you. You've mentioned legacy, levers, and leadership. We're in a conversation. These are the things that happen when you fall over each other's words in the interest we have in each other's perspective. So local, that's the next L word for me. All of that comes to, I think, a real meaningful point in people's lived experience in their neighbourhoods, in places like Glasgow and other council areas across Scotland and the UK. In terms of how that leadership is applied, it has to be about what goes on in your street and what goes on in your city. And that actually means that there's a debate to be had between places like Glasgow and the national administrations at Scottish and UK level about the sorts of powers we have to do the sorts of things we'd like to do. And I think it's interesting, Doug, I mean, just to give you an example, when you talk about air quality, you can talk about the complex physics and chemistry of what happens when you burn a hydrocarbon and what it does in the atmosphere, what it does in your lungs. And that's all, peer-reviewed science. It's not something that many of us are qualified to understand too well. But what our great-grandparents understood only too well, and the question which people often put to me is exactly who runs those buses and in whose interests are they administered, who is in control, who gets to choose what happens with our cities and the places in which we live. And I think those are questions that people understand because they're about democracy and power and choice. And I think post-COVID as well, that's come back to the fore. If you look at issues like the use of public space, with Glasgow especially throwing open a lot more of the roads to wheelers, walkers and cyclists, and not banning cars, but deprivileging the individual motor car. Looking at what happens in a city like Glasgow, where almost 70% of us live in flats without access to gardens or decent back courts. So the issue of green space comes to the fore. And so whilst a lot of the questions we're talking about are technical around the science, and maybe technical in terms of management science about complex diagrams of systems, a lot of them are readily understood in terms of local people's control over the assets they have, the powers we'd like to wield, and the kind of life we'd like to be able to live. And I think those are ones that really enjoy a much greater degree of participatory democracy, which is important because that's at the heart of the climate crisis too.
Yeah, I mean, human beings have to be at the heart of this. It sounds like, and the idea that this, local circular economies, a well-being economy. The idea is that we need a new economic model for growth at an individual level, community level, and what is that economic model that is going to be so difficult to transition from if we've got a current business as usual. With COP26 a matter of weeks away, how important is that for local? And that idea that we have significant barriers to address in order to shift or to transform?
That's a fantastic question, Doug. Listen, you can tell people, your listeners can hear from my accent. I wasn't born in Glasgow, but I spent almost my entire adult life here. I was here as a student for the Year of Culture in 1990, and I've seen the ripples of that expanding outwards ever since. And also, when I was first in Glasgow, the economy and especially Glasgow's industrial economy was still hollowing out. And it's been a very traumatic transition. And one of the things that the Scottish Just Transition Commission said about the move away from fossil fuels towards a greener and cleaner economy is that we must have, quote, a manageable and orderly transition. All of our history is nothing but a disorderly and unmanaged transition from one economic model to another. So actually the notion that you can somehow put it in dry dock while you shift to another model is impossible. We all know that. But there are different ways of approaching these things which can protect our most vulnerable, support our businesses, and have a debate about where we're going. That debate, I think, has been provoked very much by the arrival of COP and, of course, by the effects of COVID as we look to recover from it. And a lot of it is about, I think, transitioning, as you've said, Doug, to a perspective based upon circular practices, more sustainable ones, and a well-being economy. Glasgow is particularly involved in that discussion through the C40 network of some of the world's largest cities committed to radical action on the climate through its Thriving Cities initiative, and particularly the economics of Cape Raworth, which will be known to many of your listeners. I won't pretend either that any of this is anything other than difficult, challenging, and provocative, because we need to engage with the business community. We need to ensure that we're clear that green business practices lead to sustainable profits, without which we don't get to have good, well-paid green jobs for our young people coming out of schools. But equally, we need to reduce the environmental impact and have that conception of perhaps a different economy before us. And I think COVID has helped to shatter much of the assumptions around that and give us an opportunity to think again. But it is a lively debate, and there are different perspectives about what growth is, what growth delivers, and what kind of growth we need to have. And I won't pretend it's anything other than difficult, but somewhere through the kind of partnerships we've got between public, private, and academic sectors, and particularly with the community, answers are beginning to emerge. And I think it's unusual to be able to see this transition before us and not just be bowled over by the waves of change that strike against us, as Glasgow indeed experienced in the 1970s onwards with the loss of heavy industry. So perhaps an optimistic note there, Doug.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be learning from our lessons or mistakes of the past, and the idea that we deregulated and moved from heavy industries without any real support for whole communities, into reskilling into other ways of working. The government would say they did the best, but we really just left, and we've still got legacy issues, negative legacy issues 25, 30, 40 years later, in not just in Scotland, but across the UK. Ex-mining, textiles, manufacturing. Surely there must be a way that we can look back into our past and say, right, is there a way that we can? And I think that there has been some really positive views on reskilling, upskilling, green skills, this transition, this support that has to be there. But equally, it's a complex system problem. There are conflicting views, obviously, of various stakeholders.
Yeah.
And we do need that collaboration, but, and we do need that unifying vision, I suppose, and a collective intent, or a coalition of the willing. As there's more pressures and possibly levers, maybe from ESG funders into businesses saying, well, we're not going to fund you, or the cost of money is going to go up if you're going to keep on doing these things that have these, off your balance sheet, off your, but a social consequence or an environmental consequence. Peter Senge, the American systems scientist, said collaboration is vital to sustain what we call profound or really deep change, because without it, organizations are just overwhelmed by the forces of the status quo. I quite like that description and just the size of the problem, but this idea of collaboration, how important do you see that?
I think that's vital. And I know many of you listeners will be aware that words like partnership and collaboration can sound a bit glib and overused, but I think they really get purchase and meaning in the discussion we're having, Doug, around the future of our climate, of our planet, and of our local economies, and the level of, the quality of life an urban place like Glasgow can offer to its residents, visitors, and businesses. And therefore, I think we're enjoined to work harder to do better. We've got a partnership called Sustainable Glasgow. People can check out its website, which brings together the business sector, the academic sector, and public. And I think that's a great platform on which to build these things. If it wasn't already there, we'd certainly have to reinvent something very similar. And of course, the key thing is, to what extent can you mobilize shared will to do the things we say we want to do? To what extent do these things exist on paper as statements, or in the lives of our institutions and communities? And the proof is to be found there. And I think some of the things we've been doing around Glasgow in terms of work on climate change adaptation, work to reduce emissions, and work to engage with communities does begin to show there's a sense really there of that absolutely making that difference. I just want to follow up a bit as well, Doug, on something you said about history. I mean, Glasgow obviously was one of the principal titans of the industrial age, and many of the assets we've drawn upon of place and people, industry, academic excellence are all still there for that next transition, as they were in the 18th century when we first gained a step or two on the rest of the world and influenced the trajectory of the rest of that world. The other thing I'd say as well about that is, you mentioned about Glasgow and industry, and actually one of the things that does link us to is a global conversation with our urban peers. Places like Pittsburgh in America, the great steel city, is one of Glasgow's key partners, because they had the same traumatic experience of the loss of the mills and a loss of meaning and purpose, which they've come through, and now they're a fantastic place. Places like Dortmund in the Ruhr Valley in Germany, very heavy industry, scarred just like Glasgow by the kind of vacant and derelict land, contaminated land, what you do with all that, and the loss again of an industrial workforce. So actually, we're not alone there. We're talking to other cities more close to home, places like Belfast and Manchester, of course. Manchester, one of the great titans alongside Glasgow of the industrial age. So I think we learn a lot there from partnership, not just within the city, but reaching out to our urban peers. And in many ways, I think what COP has shown Glasgow, to quote the leader of the council, is that whilst nation states make pledges at places like COP, it's cities that are delivering on the promise of a low carbon and climate resilient future. And cities, I always say, manage somehow to be the locus of many of the wicked problems we face, but also the place where the solutions are found, where new forms of living are forged in that new kind of crucible of urban life.
Yeah, I read a report, an academic paper just not long ago, talking about the kind of almost disappointment of these country or region-sized pledges, global pledges, and then country pledges. But actually, the mechanisms and the doing capabilities are going to come from mostly our urban environments or cities. Obviously, there's rural communities that have to be part of this, but that these could be the engines for change. They've got much more adaptability, agility, possibly than at the country level. But that joining up, not just collaboration within the context of a city, possibly, but that collaboration between cities. We at Insight Futures, we do a lot around trying to establish models or systems for change that not only work in one context, but in similar contexts, not perfectly transferred, but there's local cultural aspects and all sorts of things. But there are similar post-industrial cities. There are similar financial centres. There are similar, so there are ways that you can maybe even have a system for changing the system that travels. Is that one of the ideas that bringing these global leaders and a huge number of visitors to Glasgow, which is the biggest event I think in Scotland, hosting the COP26. It's not just to this date in a few weeks' time; it's beyond it. And I suppose that the opportunity for that mapping systems, understanding that complex ways of working. Every system is perfectly designed to deliver the outcomes it generates. If you want to change outcomes, you have to redesign the system kind of thing. But also, how does your strategy engage the system in order to have highly leveraged impact? And how can we test our assumptions and hypotheses so we can learn and adapt effectively? I think we need to take almost a lean startup view, because there are big bets, but there's a series of small bets possibly that communities, some multi-stakeholder collaborations can try and identify the significant assumptions, design experiments to test and de-risk the learning process to learn as fast as possible, so that these models can then become not just successful in that location, but potentially then also repeatable and transferable. Is that partly what Glasgow's focusing on post-COP?
I think so, Doug. We're looking forward to welcoming other cities and city mayors. We're not in the place of the nation states. We leave that to the UK and Scotland, but absolutely our places with our urban peers, from which we learn and to which hopefully our experience offers some lessons to. And on the day after COP, we'll continue to be engaging with them, be it Manchester, just south of Glasgow, Pittsburgh, a long way west, or further afield into East Asia with some of the great cities there. And I think that's one of the legacies we'll get, practically speaking, from COP. And I wouldn't also underestimate the extent to which we've been able, through the sad reality of the crisis around COVID, to engage better with those cities, because you don't need to get on an airplane. You sit in front of a screen and you talk to your peers. That's not perfect, but it has actually linked us to those discussions in ways we perhaps couldn't have conceived of beforehand. I just want to pick up on something you said there that I think is absolutely crucial, Doug. You said de-risk learning. And I think the risks are not just in terms of profit margins, institutional outcomes. They are about culture. They are about the extent to which we feel a bit vulnerable when you own up to the fact that, frankly, I don't have the answer to this. But if I talk to you and you're not horrible to me, we might just have a kind of participative conversation whereby we can come to a solution. I'm a big believer in that. I'm a big believer in the absolute spark that happens when interested people start talking to each other, not necessarily immediately about their work, but if you start talking, say, what book did you read this summer? What's your favorite novel or film? What does it tell you? You begin, I think, to kind of engage with that right hemisphere, intuitive, creative side, along with the left hemisphere, which is technical and much more managerial. I know we need both. And you think, again, going back to earlier industrial ages, there's a great book called The Lunar Society about how people, I think in the 18th century, around Birmingham, walking by the light of the moon, came together. And you had industrialists, poets, religious people, artists, and so on. And they were all interested in why they were doing things and how they were doing things. There was no distinction between making profit for business and seeing what an artist was doing and things like that. I think probably we need to re-engage with that original urban innovation that we had, which is, of course, partly about technical knowledge, but trying to avoid compartmentalization is going to be important, because when you talk about systems, Doug, too many of us are just, I'm not going to use the word silo because it's overused, but too many of us are found in one particular place and perhaps have become incurious, perhaps have not really wanted to reach across to other people, perhaps feel a little bit nervous about the exposure that puts us to. And we should just admit, don't have the answers. It's almost an emotional thing to say, we don't have the answers. This crisis is beyond comprehension if we're not careful. But if we get together, perhaps we can once again, invoke that spirit of partnership and creativity based upon fundamentally a curiosity and preparedness to reach across to people. I think that's going to be crucial. And that's a cultural issue, Doug, that's not always easy to breach. But I think one of the challenges we undoubtedly face, which COP helps us, if nothing else, to push forward a bit.
Yeah, you've triggered a number of thoughts there, Duncan. One around the psychological safety to admit you don't know something, and I think I always like the idea of the more they learn, the less I know, and I love the idea of learning. And I think that as you get more senior in your positions in work, CEOs are expected to predict the future, and no one can predict the future. But I think the global pandemic has given us this common sense of uncertainty, and we need to think differently. We need to have a new mindset, new ways of thinking, and new ways of engaging with each other, which says we don't know what we're doing. And it isn't a reflection on our capability. It's actually a strong, powerful admission of saying, right, we actually have to drop our guard a bit with each other and be able to, if they can create safe enough environments.
Yeah.
Creativity, as you say, is hugely important, and bringing different people from different contexts coming together. If we kind of been engineering for 30 years, we probably come with an engineering point of view. But I remember historically working with a university looking at a complex problem, and we brought some gamers in, who looked at it and they solved the problem that had been baffling scientists for 12 years in about 8 hours, because they didn't know the rules they were breaking or the ways that they weren't confined by that way of thinking. So I think that multi-perspective, safety, creating safety, creativity, and this idea of exploring together and welcoming each other's different perspectives is obviously an opportunity for COP, but beyond COP within the Glasgow environment.
I always love the example that brings together science and art, where of the benzene ring, which was conceived by the German chemist Kekulé. No one could work out how C6H6 could be even written down, how the bonds, the double bonds between the carbon, which seem to shift across the benzene structure, could be conceived, until one night Kekulé went to bed and he conceived of a snake eating its tail, which gave us the benzene ring, a sort of shared electron cloud. And that's very much a part of what Jung would call a human archetype. It's an Ouroboros. It comes out throughout religious history. But it's because I think essentially he went to bed and the right hemisphere started working, whereas the left had just given up on the problem. And I'm kind of minded there to follow up on something you said earlier as well, Doug, about predicting the future. I think this is a key one about the resilience agenda. You can't predict what's going to happen, but you can see trends. For instance, alongside the climate crisis, we know that there's maybe an issue around the future of work, around automation and robotics, and what that'll do to hollow out even further across the blue and then into the white collar kind of work, especially around driverless vehicles, perhaps. And then maybe a response to that is universal basic income. I'm just offering that as a thought. It's not necessarily something I endorse, but it's interesting to see where you go with that conversation. And one of the things about the resilience agenda I think is really important, Doug, is not that you are able to predict the future, though, if we get together, we're in a better position to do so, but that you have the kinds of safety nets, flexibility and conversation going, that when the unknown turns up, you're not going to be shattered by the first hammer blow, because you can kind of bend and accommodate it and then come back again. And I think that's really important. Again, that's a question about democracy, about the systems we have, about the preparedness to own up to a lack of knowledge, but a preparedness to talk to people that could fill those gaps, knowing that the future will never be certain. And we didn't predict the COVID crisis, and yet we already knew there's a climate emergency looming over us. So different ways in which I think we can engage with each other are at the heart of that. And COP, if nothing else, is a conversation amongst nation states, in our case amongst cities, and especially amongst communities about, well, where do you think we're going to go? What is life about? The earliest question asked by the Greek city-states, what is the good life? How do you want to live? We still ask ourselves that, and quite properly. And it's not always easy for people like me working in local government. We get our toes held to the fire, but that's democracy. That should happen. And if nothing else, Glasgow is a robust democracy where people make their voices heard, and that's a good thing.
We're certainly not shy here in Glasgow, but
no.
I think you make some wonderful points. It's a kind of almost the Medici effect that we had. Even the first Enlightenment in Scotland, could we see a second Enlightenment in and from Scotland and connected to other countries and states, cities that think in similar ways? You mentioned universal basic income, for example. I mean, that comes down to basic security. We are all very different when we're insecure, and this horribly unfortunate pandemic has created, for the first time in our living history, a common experience that's been across the globe. Everybody on the planet has been affected in some way by the same thing. And we are considering, possibly we've had a kind of a very reflective time. Those who've been on furlough, those who've been affected positively or negatively, the health, our sense of our own potential death. These are quite existential things that we've had to consider as organisations, as people, and possibly it has allowed us to create some room and more sustained room for thinking and acting differently, to think more about why we're here, what we're doing, how do we engage with each other. What is a more sustainable model that allows us to have basic security, even if we look at Maslow's hierarchy, and a universal basic income. The fact that that's been discussed on the left and the right and in different parts of the world, it is possibly very positive. And that there is this, at least because of COP, this global gathering. There are others that happen in G7, the G20, and various other World Bank events and things like that. But, just to finish off, do you think we'll get to a Glasgow agreement? Do you have a confidence and optimism around post-COP, how we can move forward? I
hope so, Doug. I hope so. And Glasgow Agreement in both senses of the expression, one that reaches out to the world and that puts us onto a safer and more just planetary trajectory and thereby puts Glasgow's name in the lexicon of global climate progress alongside that of Paris. And also, of course, a Glasgow Agreement on the day after COP where we can do better locally for this city, its people, to build a better future, and one where absolutely sustainability and social justice go together. If there's one message from Glasgow to the world, it is that. And the leader of the council has been clear as she's gone out on the airwaves and compassed the world several times over via digital platforms. These things need to go together. We need to deliver a low carbon, climate resilient and just future for Glasgow and for the planet. And I can think of no better point at which to conclude our discussions than that. Of course, it's merely an end of a chapter, Doug. You and I will have many, many further discussions to come.
Well, on that positive note, thanks very much for your time, Duncan, and sharing your insight on what levers are critical for us to move forward. Thanks again.
Thank you, Doug.
Well, folks, that was our CEO, Doug Morwood, and Duncan Booker of Glasgow City Council discussing levers. Links to both parties' social media channels can be found in the bio. Tune in next Friday, where we'll be joined by another guest to look at convening authority. Thanks for listening and enjoy the weekend.